Hey, well, welcome everyone to our first edition of Big Issues tonight, and we are discussing the right to die, as you'll know by now. And this is coming to you from St. Paul's Simon Street in Auckland, but I'm really also aware that there'll be many of you who are joining us from outside that church community. So I want to really welcome you into what I think is going to be a fascinating and we hope a really enriching conversation tonight. We've got some great guests lined up that we want to welcome here. So you're very welcome to tonight. Where we're discussing what we believe is a critically important principle around the right to die, but also a very particular piece of legislation which has its own life and its own distinctive characteristics. Just a really important thing I want to say right at the outset is obviously this is a social issue that is in the public square, and we are debating this tonight. We're discussing it in a live, open forum. But it's important to say that we are doing that in the distinctive space of the church. And so you'll hear some of our guests tonight speaking from angles that include theological and faith perspectives. And we think that's a really important part of this discussion tonight. We are going live tonight, as you'll know, but we just want to assure you that tonight's session is being recorded. And so you'll be able to see this after tonight, but also to share it with others. And we just hope this will be a resource that you'll be able to pass on as we approach the election and this really important referendum. I want to just invite and welcome our speakers, introduce them just a little bit tonight. You're going to hear from them as we go. We're joined by Sam Bloore. Many of you will know Sam if you're part of the St. Paul's community, a regular speaker with us. He's formerly a practicing doctor, currently works for the Venn Foundation, and he is part of our community and regularly speaks among us. We're also joined by Danielle van Dalen, who's a researcher at the Maxim Institute and has a particular focus around policy and the legislation around issues of the right to die. Finally, we've got with us Dr. Amanda Landers, who's coming to us from the Deep South in Otago. She is at the University of Otago, and she is a clinical senior lecturer in the area of palliative care. And just interesting talking to Amanda before this, that she's been involved in this capacity in around about 5,000 deaths. And so it brings a pretty broad and deep perspective on these issues. Now, obviously, we want this to be a place where you can share questions, engage with our guests throughout the night. And you'll see on the side of your screen that there's a comment thread. And we want this to be a place where you can ask questions, and you can start that now throughout the course of the night. We'd ask that you just use it for this purpose rather than as a typical comment thread, just so that we can stay really focused on the discussion that's happening on the screen. Hey, so welcome Danielle, Amanda, and Sam. It's great to have you with us. We really appreciate you taking part in this session. And without further ado, Sam is going to get us started tonight, and just to speak a little bit around the actual principle of issues around the right to die and euthanasia. And Sam, I want to just really ask you a first question that when we actually talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide, what are we actually talking about when we use those terms?
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I'll cover that just maybe in some broad brush strokes, and then I might later on, as we move into some discussion and Q&A, might even get Danielle to actually flesh out some of the finer points of that. Got a comment first, mate, on the darkness of your room and the lightness of mine. I've come into the church offices here to do this, and I've landed in the Fibonacci room, which is wonderful, but I do feel like I've sort of dropped into a Christopher Nolan film with everything going on in the background. So if you're feeling a little dark and murky, mate, you can come and join me here on the come away from the dark side and into the light. Listen, what I might do is share my screen and have the opening slide, because I think I've chosen I guess you might say a controversial graphic to have as my opening one. I gave a lecture at the University of Otago a few years ago now, and this was the title of that: Knocking on Heaven's Door, Theology, Popular Culture and New Zealand's Ongoing Fascination with Euthanasia. People who have been at St Paul's for a long time, some of what I'll cover in the next sort of 25 minutes or so will be very similar to a talk that I gave about 3 years ago here at St Paul's, 2.5 years ago. But I've sort of gone for this rather sort of controversial looking image on purpose, and it's important that we understand that what we're being asked to vote on in this referendum is euthanasia and assisted suicide. And it's a specific piece of legislation too. So we'll discuss a little bit more later on. There are people who are pro-euthanasia, but are actually against this particular euthanasia law. They're actually going to vote no because this law is so bad. And again, I've mentioned Danielle and Amanda will be able to dig into some of the details of why this particular law, which is probably going, if it goes through, be the most liberal law around this in the world, why it's particularly bad. But what we're not voting on is whether people are allowed to say no to medical treatment. People have always been allowed to do that. You've always been allowed to refuse medical treatment. You've always been able to say no to ongoing things that are becoming too burdensome. What we're being asked to vote on is law that will see euthanasia, so the giving of a lethal injection as per my graphic here, or to be given medication that you then take yourself, and assisted suicide. So just right from the get-go, that's what we're talking about, and we'll cover some of the detail of that. If you're really interested in more detail, I don't often Google myself, but I did this afternoon just to check that it's still there. This is the talk that I gave for Otago. You'll see there it runs to about 1:23. So that might be more than many of you want in terms of detail. But if you want to go a bit deeper on some of these things, ground I won't be able to cover tonight, then you can go and look that up. I feel like I've got more skin in the game than I had when I was a medical student. I actually did a master's in ethics, bioethics, as I went through med school many years ago, and there was a piece of legislation before Parliament then. Peter Brown actually had a bill before Parliament. This is going right back to the mid-90s, and we've had several iterations since then. Michael Law's had a bill, and then actually it might have been the other way around. I think Michael Law's bill, then Peter Brown's, then Marion Street's bill. Some of you will remember that. And then, of course, after the Lucretia Seales case and that being picked up by David Seymour, we're into our latest round. But since then, I mean, I have been trying to distance myself a little bit from medicine. I've moved into theology and church-related work, but I've been sort of pulled back into the conversation in this latest round. But some things have happened that have meant that I've got more skin in the game this time around. This is a picture of our wedding, Jules and I. This is 10 years ago. That's my dad on the right, and he usually would have had a full head of hair, but he was in his 7th round of having a relapse of lymphoma, and he passed away 3 months after this photo was taken, actually. And I had to give a speech at his funeral only 3 months after he'd given one at my wedding, and that was a tough time for the family, particularly those last few weeks looking after Dad. And yet, and I'll have a bit more to say about dignity in a moment, I think we all managed to make it through his drawn-out death in the end with our dignities intact. Only about 6 months after the Lucretia Seales case, I actually had to oversee the funeral of a friend who passed away from a brain tumour herself, leaving behind a husband and a 2-year-old daughter. And so again, this was brought really close to home soon after the Lucretia Seales case. And then I had, in June of that same year, open heart surgery to repair a mitral valve. And so I was sort of forced to confront my own mortality in a way that I hadn't had to up until then. So I say all of that just because it's felt like I've had more skin in the game. And if anything that I say in the next sort of 20 minutes or so comes across as insensitive to very difficult cases that you've had take place in your whānau or with friends, then I apologise for that. My intent isn't to be insensitive, as I'm sure Danielle and Amanda would echo as well. We're on holy ground when we come to talk about issues of life and death. And it's sort of important, if we dive straight into church-related references, that we sort of remove our sandals and realise that we are on holy ground here. This is for many people, very emotionally charged territory. I'm actually going to run through what I see as the three main arguments for euthanasia and just respond to them. Pain and suffering, dignity and autonomy. There's been something, I think, of an evolution actually in the arguments put forward. As I say, in the 90s, when I first got drawn into this conversation, there was a lot of focus on pain and suffering. But as our pain management and palliative care has continued to improve, and it's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than it was then, and yet people are still actually making decisions based on a death they saw in the 1980s or the 1970s or 60s. We've become a lot better at being able to treat pain and suffering, and Amanda can speak a bit more to that later on. But we've sort of seen a bit of an evolution through these, and it's been reflected in the names of the Act. So Marion Street's bill was the Death with Dignity Act. There was more of a focus on dignity. In other words, I shouldn't have to prove that I'm in pain and suffering. This is just an insult to my dignity. Like my dignity requires that I have a death on my own terms. And then finally, there's been really a swing to just out-and-out autonomy or choice. And again, the title of David Seymour's bill reflects this. It's the end-of-life choice bill. I shouldn't have to prove to you that I'm suffering or that I'm even feeling undignified. This is quite pure and simply, it's my choice. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn. I'm going to do it in reverse order: autonomy and choice, dignity and suffering. And I'm going to offer a theological reflection and then a sort of an other reflection, if you like. Johnny's already said we are a church, unapologetically. And so I'm going to try and sort of weave a bit of integration between these. Any theologians listening will sort of bristle at the thought that there's sort of theology and other. All of life is theological when you're looking through a framework like that. And yet I'm going to try and give you some things that you can reflect on and see that your faith is integrated in some of these, but also some other reflections, some arguments that you might be able to more easily raise with family and friends who maybe don't share your theological assumptions. You can share around the water cooler at work. And if you've tuned in and you don't go to a church, you don't have a faith that sort of underpins this, hopefully you won't be put off by those references along the way. I think we're going to cover some reasons why, despite the really, really difficult cases, and we would all acknowledge that there are difficult cases, but in solving those few through this legislation, we open the door to some unforeseen consequences, some unintended consequences that I think Amanda, Danielle and I would agree are become increasingly problematic, and there are jurisdictions around the world where this is happening. So I'm going to talk about autonomy and choice first, and the first thing I'd want to say about this under a theological reflection is that one of the first things you acknowledge as a person of faith is that there is a nature and consequence of our creatureliness. There is a creator and we are creatures, and it's impossible to overestimate the difference between creator and creature. And so our autonomy and our individuality has limits. I think we see in the Christian faith a notion we see in Scripture, certainly in its first few pages, a notion of a power too great for us to safely possess. You sort of think the Garden of Eden, a grasping after something that you really can't actually contain. You weren't designed to handle that amount of sort of power or that particular right. Sort of think Lord of the Rings, this thing you want so badly. When you get it, it's so powerful. It ends up almost by definition becoming corrupting and having consequences that you couldn't have dreamed of when you first went after it. In terms of another reflection, autonomy is a really fluid concept. Oftentimes we'll limit our autonomy to protect ourselves and others. So there's a sense in which it's fluid because we apply some fluidity to it and we actually say no to certain things. We limit what we want to do. We actually have laws that make us put on seatbelts and other things to protect ourselves. But it's fluid in other ways too. It's open to coercion, and coercions can be external or they can be internal. And as somebody who went through, I showed you the picture of a significant medical procedure. I was amazed at the vulnerability that brought up, and how I sort of went with the flow and sort of expectations of those around me. And I'm someone who was otherwise fit and healthy and young and still in control of all of my faculties. But the idea that autonomy is just this thing that is fixed and never changes is quite a myth. And again, Amanda can probably speak to this when we come to particularly end of life, where people's kind of moods are shifting, their decision making is changing over time, and they're often making calls one minute that they want to retract the next, and part of that, the privilege of walking with people through that is to help them navigate that space as they do that. Here's a long quote from a piece that this doctor here, William Toffler, wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote this in 2015. It was called A Doctor-Assisted Disaster for Medicine. He hints here at some of that fluidity of autonomy. Since voters of Oregon narrowly legalized physician-assisted suicide 20 years ago, there's been a profound shift in attitude towards medical care, new fear and secrecy, and a fixation on death. Well over 850 people have taken their lives by ingesting massive overdoses of barbiturates prescribed under the law. Proponents claim the system's working well with no problems. This is not true. As a professor of family medicine at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, as well as a licensed physician for 35 years, I've seen firsthand how the law has changed the relationship between doctors and patients, some of whom now fear they are being steered towards assisted suicide. In one case, a patient with bladder cancer contacted me. She was concerned that an oncologist treating her might be one of the death doctors, and she questioned his motives. This was particularly worrying to her after she obtained a second opinion from another oncologist who was more positive about her prognosis and treatment options. Here's his point. Whichever of the consultants was correct, such fears were never an issue before. In other words, he's saying we've introduced into the life of this poor lady now something beyond just the diagnosis that she's having to grapple with, but now a sort of a second guessing at a time of stress as to which medical professions might be for her, which medical professionals might be for her and which might be against. Now, it doesn't matter whether there's no medical professions that are against you. What matters is the perception on the part of the patient. And in that piece, William Toffler says that they're getting calls every week at the university where he's at. So it's open to coercion, and the elderly, the vulnerable, the depressed, the grieving, these are people who are particularly prone to that. I think as well it's worth noting the complexity and dysfunction of families. A lot of the calls for euthanasia are being made by people who are enjoying the love and support of strong family units. I heard Matt Vickers being interviewed just last week, and he did a great job. And I'm still moved by his case and the case of Lucretia. But there she was, surrounded by him and her family, all lovingly supporting her in that. But I've worked in medicine long enough, and church actually, long enough to see just the level of dysfunction that can be quite common in families. I've got several friends who are lawyers and do work in family law, and they're dead against this because they see that complexity all the time. They see what happens when money's at stake, when there's been sort of prior wrongs that are being played out, there's been abuse of any kind in a family. And so autonomy is not this kind of static thing. Moving on to dignity. Again, just quickly a couple of thoughts theologically on this. You can't really talk about the dignity of human persons without sort of mentioning the image of God, Imago Dei. Dignity is bestowed. We don't achieve our dignity. We don't sort of, manufacture it for ourselves. We can and should bestow dignity on each other. And we can and should be doing that even in the most sort of quote unquote undignified of circumstances. I think that's what I managed to do for Dad, me and my siblings and Mum and the wider family. Taking Dad to the toilet, doing things for him that as a proud person, I just knew he was wishing he could do for himself. But you can bestow dignity in those moments. I think Scripture upends our understandings of who's dignified, just who's dignified and who's not. We see special mention being given to the least of these, to the weak, to the poor, the widow, the orphan. These are kind of placeholders in Scripture. Oftentimes they're painting a picture, an image of those who would have been very undignified in the surrounding Greco-Roman culture. But actually Christian culture is saying, no, these people deserve special dignity. They've got a special place in this kind of upside down way of looking at the world. In some other reflections, I'd want to say dignity too is a fluid concept, and you can find yourself suddenly thrust into a position that feels quite undignified, and it takes time to adjust to this perceived sense of a loss of dignity, to a diagnosis that suddenly gets thrust upon you, and you sort of suddenly are looking at this future. I can remember the car ride home after the cardiologist broke the news to me that I was going to be having open heart surgery within the next 6 weeks. It's kind of like you're driving home in a bit of a daze, trying to work out like what's this future look like, and that was a non-terminal condition. Someone can receive euthanasia within 4 days of a diagnosis under the legislation that we're being asked to vote on. I mean, that's just staggering to anyone who's done any work in helping people to process diagnoses. That's just a staggeringly insufficient amount of time for you to even begin to get your head around what the future might look like, however limited that is. Not to mention, and again, Amanda can talk to this, how terrible we are at diagnosing this mythical 6 months of terminality. I think as well, calling a condition undignified sends a message to others. And this really is something that I've heard a lot from friends and those who are spokespeople in the disability space. And I appreciate that the disabled community is not speaking just with a single voice, and there are a range of opinions here. But by far the majority that I have heard from are expressing really real concerns. And it's not so much concerns that someone's going to want to take their life. It's more just that the sorts of things that you are now saying should qualify someone to be, I can see how that would be undignified for you, not being able to look after yourself, doing those sorts of things. They're like, that's our life. Liz Carr is a comedian from the UK, and she says, I can understand why people wouldn't ever affect. And society's understanding of dignity can and does change over time. And we don't have to imagine that. We don't have to sort of imagine what the counterfactual is. There are actually jurisdictions we can look to who have gone there, and we can see what has happened. This is a guy called Gerbert van Lernen. He wrote a book called Do You Call This a Life? After his experience with a family member in which they had a profound disability after surgery sort of went wrong and there was a bleed in the brain. They chose not to take euthanasia even though that was offered to them. They survived another 10 years. But Gerbert van Lernen was just shocked at the change in attitudes that he saw amongst Dutch people in that decade journey that he went on. And so he actually felt so strongly about this that he flew out to New Zealand and made a submission before our select committees, because he was just so not wanting New Zealand to go down this track. But he says legalisation becomes normalisation, and that moves on to expectation. He says, I was once an average Dutchman who thought that euthanasia was one of the crown jewels of our liberal country, but I became someone who was shocked by the harsh tone used by the Dutch when they talked about disabled life. So I want to move on. I'm getting close to my time. I want to close with a couple of thoughts on suffering, and really, this is one that really moves me. If you're not moved by the difficult cases where, despite our best efforts, we're not able to get on top of someone's suffering, be that sort of physical suffering, or be that emotional suffering, then you should be moved by those cases. I'm moved by them. But we're not being asked about whether we've ever seen a difficult case. And most of the proponents of this they've had a one-off terrible experience. And I get that. I've got sympathy for that. But we're being asked to vote on a law change. And the point that I'm wanting to drive home is that in solving it for those few cases, I think there being these consequences that we hadn't bargained on, but we should be moved by suffering. So I want to say something in the other reflection space, and then close with a bit of a challenge to us in the theological space as a church. The first thing around this is, again, if you want to keep the fluidity word going, then suffering's a bit fluid as well. It's subjective by nature. It's subjective by definition. If I think I'm suffering and you don't, then by definition I'm right, because it's my suffering. And that's why no safeguards are working anywhere. Canada, within 12 months of putting through legislation on this, had cases before its High Court of people wanting to opt in. So it's not that doctors are stretching the boundaries. Patients are asking for it. A human right tends towards universalizing. That's what a human right wants to do. Why does my suffering not qualify? Why terminal for 6 months? Why not 12? Why is that form of suffering count and my form of suffering not? And so once a law has changed, people find it very difficult to hold to the line, because the patients themselves are mounting sort of legal action to be included. And so again, these are older cases now. Danielle will have much more up-to-date cases, but among those euthanized in Belgium, some years ago, deaf 45-year-old twins who are going blind, a 44-year-old woman with chronic anorexia nervosa, a 64-year-old woman with chronic depression, and that was without informing her family. My point isn't that these people aren't suffering. My point is that those who voted for this in Belgium when it first went through never would have imagined that the goalposts would have kept moving, that the law courts find it very difficult to then hold to the line when you've again got very moving cases who are wanting to opt in. And so here's a graphing where that went up until the latest graph that I got a hold of. Again, this is a bit out of date now, but you can see how things remained static for a while and then moved upwards. So just one final longer quote. This is from the Netherlands. It's a guy called Theo Boer, and he was actually on the review committee in the Netherlands. And he wrote this in 2007. In 2007, he's referring to something else that he wrote. I'll come back to the quote in a minute, but here's the graph in the Netherlands, quite similar to the one in Belgium. So you know he's going to write something in 2007, and look how that stays flat through 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. He's going to then talk about that uptick that you see from there. In 2007, I wrote that there doesn't need to be a slippery slope when it comes to euthanasia. A good euthanasia law in combination with a euthanasia review procedure provides the warrants for a stable and relatively low number of euthanasia cases. Most of my colleagues drew the same conclusion, but we were wrong. Terribly wrong, in fact. Beginning in 2008, the number of these deaths showed an increase of 15% annually, year after year. Euthanasia is on the way to becoming a default mode of dying for cancer patients. The Dutch Right to Die Society shows no signs of being satisfied even with these developments. They will not rest until a lethal pill is made available to anyone over 70 years who wishes to die. Some slopes truly are slippery. Whereas in the first years after 2002, hardly any patients with psychiatric illnesses or dementia appeared in reports, these numbers are now sharply on the rise. Cases have been reported in which a large part of the suffering of those given euthanasia or assisted suicide consisted in being aged, lonely, or bereaved. Some of these patients could have lived for years or decades. Not even the review committees, and he's been on these committees, despite hard and conscientious work, have been able to halt these developments. I used to be a supporter of legislation, but now with 12 years of experience, I take a different view. Once the genie's out of the bottle, it's not likely to ever go back in again. I've showed you that graph already. And so to close really with a challenge to us around suffering. Are we as Christians, are we as the church ready to put our money and our time and our emotions where our mouth is and really care for the dying? And by really caring, sometimes it's care and it's only care. Again, I think the medical profession has been guilty of abandoning patients behind increasing care, if that makes sense. So throwing another treatment at the person rather than taking care to say, what does appropriate care look like here? I think one of the ways we can abandon people is to vote yes to this legislation and actually bring in euthanasia. But I also think it can be an abandonment of sorts to over-care for people, or over-treat them, I should say, to just keep putting treatment out there. On my kind of negative days, I do wonder whether a law change is inevitable. If not this round, then next round. But really, when I come back to this challenge to us, are we really going to care, and are we going to pay the cost for that care? In some ways, I'm hoping, I'm certainly doing talks like this to try and convince people to vote no. I'm praying that we don't see euthanasia introduced for these reasons that I've put forward. But in some ways, if we do see a law change, then the church's role isn't over. In some ways, it's only just beginning. Are we going to continue to take up the challenge of caring for those who are facing illness, facing grief, facing diagnoses, facing loneliness? Are we going to take up the challenge to provide care in those very difficult and often quite complex situations? So thanks for your time. I promised both Danielle and Amanda that I'm going to be very quiet for the Q&A, so to allow them plenty of time to respond, fill in some of the gaps to what I've talked about. And thanks for your attention. Johnny, I'll hand back to you from my very bright Fibonacci room here. Appreciate your attention.
Hey, thanks, Sam. We appreciate you helping us just understand particularly the principle of euthanasia and some of the issues around it. And just to remind you that we are going to open up to questions. So if you could provide your questions down in the comment threads, we'd love to get to those as we open it up to our panelists. And Sam, you're very welcome to be involved in this, of course, as well. But Dr. Amanda, I'm going to come to you first. And you have been involved in palliative care and end of life as a vocational profession for a really long time. You've seen a lot, and obviously you're heavily involved in this legislation in terms of reviewing it and strong opinions about it. But what do you see as some of the burning issues around?
I think there's probably two main concerns for me. One, Sam's alluded to, which is the Act itself. It's 30 pages long or so, 34 pages, as opposed to, say, the latest law that's been introduced in Victoria, which is about 160 pages. And that's because it's had consultation, as opposed to our New Zealand Act that's had no consultation with any medical associations. It hasn't had consultation with Māori or Pacific, disability, any group really. And when you read it, you can tell because it doesn't make sense in some parts. So pretty hard to vote yes on an act that's going to go straight into law with no amendments to it that actually isn't fit for purpose. And the second concern I have is around the impact on doctors and the fact that sort of 6 of the criteria, only 2 of them are objective, that being age and citizenship, and the other 4 are completely policed by doctors. The government will not know what's going on the ground. It'll just be tick boxes and forms at the government level. But on the ground, in terms of the health system and what's actually happening for doctors, there's really going to be no real knowledge gathering of what that's doing to the doctor-patient relationship.
Thanks, Dr. Amanda. Danielle, you looked at this long and hard from a sort of policy perspective. What's your, when you look at this act, when you look at what's sort of going on around its process, what are the sort of key issues that you see in relation to it?
Yeah, it's been years now of research and analysis looking at this legislation and legislation from around the world in jurisdictions where this kind of legislation is passed. Also places that have considered the legislation and said no. And I've had the incredible privilege and sometimes the challenge of talking to doctors, particularly to doctors like Amanda, who regularly also who specialise in end-of-life care, talking to lawyers and ethicists and politicians and even people who would be eligible under this legislation. And that's been really helpful for me in understanding, well, what will the words on the page look like when we put them into practice? A couple of weeks ago, I was having a conversation with a doctor, and the way he frames it, part of this conversation, I think is really helpful and builds on some of what Sam has already spoken about. But around this, he talks about the idea of perfect choice and autonomy, and if we were going to offer perfect choice, well, you could make the lethal drugs available to pharmacy for anyone to purchase, and then they could purchase those drugs, they could take them home and choose to take them whenever they wanted. But we don't live in a libertarian paradise. We recognise that choices should sometimes be constrained so that we can be protected. And instead, what this act is trying to do is it's asking doctors to draw a boundary between rational suicide and irrational suicide within the restrictions of the Act. And there are 2 points, I think, within that. The first is that when you take those words off the page, when you take the text of the Act and you put it into practice, the criteria offers an illusion of certainty. And I'm happy to answer some more questions about that later on. But I think actually when you see the Act in practice, or this kind of legislation in practice, you see that there are a lot of gaps. And then the second thing is that we're actually kind of talking about creating these boundaries. And there's a British judge, a retired British judge and Baroness, Elizabeth Butler-Sloss, who puts this really well. So I'm just going to quickly read a quote from her. She says that laws, like nation states, are more secure when their boundaries rest on natural frontiers. The law that we have rests on just such a frontier. It rests on the principle that involving ourselves in deliberately bringing about the death of others for whatever reason is unacceptable behaviour. To create exceptions based on arbitrary criteria, such as terminal illness or mental capacity, is to create lines in the sand, easily crossed and hard to defend. The law is there to protect us, and we tinker with it at our peril. I think that's a really powerful quote, but it's also, I think it's important to keep in mind that as both opponents and proponents of the legislation have this conversation and are trying to respond compassionately to end of life, it's really important that we look at the experience overseas. And really, when I look at that international experience, what I've seen is that it's impossible to maintain these artificial boundaries, and that they will move over time.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, Amanda, I want to come back to you just around the just drawing back out a little bit again, because I think some of this is about autonomy and choice, and that's really the end of the matter for a lot of people. It's a libertarian argument around the consent of the individual as a self-choosing entity. But I think a lot of it is backed up also around the concept of what is death like in our society, and it's almost become a mythical concept for many of us. We don't observe it close at hand. We hear, anecdotes which are used to sort of, put forward a certain point of view. Often they're quite extreme, but you have been involved, really at the coalface of, you said earlier, 5,000 deaths around about in your profession. And just helps for us, I think, to understand a little bit about what is the nature of death? What does that journey actually look like? And how does this act speak into that?
I guess just before I get into normal dying, just to talk about that choice argument, because it's actually ironic that this act will probably limit choice. And I'll just explain explain how it will limit choice. So if you get a diagnosis like Sam mentioned, and you can actually decide to die within 4 days, you really haven't had the opportunity to know what your other options were, what your choices were. So in my role as a palliative care doctor, my job is to come to you, and I often say to the patients, it's a little bit like a 1980s smorgasbord. I'm going to lie out your different options, and you and I get to choose together. You talk me through what's meaningful for you and what you value in life, and I'll talk you through what your options are. Now, there's no way that this legislation can make sure that that happens. So those of us who work in palliative care can see clearly that this act is going to limit choice. That's the irony. So that's the first thing. The second thing is around normal dying. So we're born and we die. And we're actually, our bodies are designed to die. We wind down, our organs become slower, and generally, and I am generalising, people have this period of time where they become more sleepy, they're in bed, they don't want to eat and drink, they're not starving. That's not a starvation issue, that's a body winding down issue. The gut doesn't want food when it's actually trying to wind down. The kidneys don't want fluid when the body's starting to wind down. So you're actually supposed to listen to what your body's wanting and not wanting. And the loved one looking on who's not feeling those things often have this perception that people are suffering when they're not. And so it was quite common for me to come into a home and the wife or the husband or the partner would say, he's terrible, he's in terrible pain, or she's terrible, you know. And I'll go into the room and I'll say, how are you? And what's the number one issue for you? And they'll say, I'm really worried about my wife. What's the second most, worrying issue for you? I'm really worried about our finances. And I really have to dig deep to get to the fourth or fifth thing, which happens to be a bit of pain. And so there's the misperception that we hear in the community quite a lot. My loved one had a terrible death. And when you drill down, what was terrible is what they experienced, not necessarily what the person dying experienced. So the most common way that we die is we fade. Over time, we actually sleep more, and we sleep to a point where we don't breathe anymore. We stop breathing. Our lungs change, our brains change, our hearts change. We're designed to do these things. Now, I'm not trying to be insensitive and saying that bad deaths don't occur, but they are rare. And this legislation's for everybody, not just for rare. And there's a saying that hard cases make bad law. And I think it's very true in this case. So I just want to assure everybody that it's very common to have a peaceful death surrounded by your family in the manner that you want. And if that's not happening, then you need to seek help because there are things available to you. There's just a few questions coming up. Do you want me to answer any of them, Johnny?
Yeah, just I'm aware that some of the questions coming up are quite specific, and so there's some detail in there, but which we'll certainly get to as we go. But if there are questions coming in that comment thread that you want to jump in on and answer, just feel free at any time to jump in and grab those.
There is one about
are there any that are sticking out for you at the moment?
Yeah, about your responsibility as a doctor. As a doctor, what would be my responsibility? So you can conscientiously object. So if a patient of mine says to me, I'm requesting assisted dying, I would be able to say, well, I actually conscientiously object to that. But I am under this act obliged to make sure that person knows and is connected with a doctor through the government group that will carry out the assisted dying. Now, I guess it depends where your conscience sits on that. For me personally, that would be like leaving a loaded gun in the house. So I didn't pull the trigger, but I left the loaded gun there. So everybody's going to have a different experience, but you cannot leave that person without linking them with an independent doctor through the government group that will carry out the assisted dying.
What are we, and is it sort of fair to say that we're hearing a common perspective from the medical profession? Are there themes that are developing in terms of what the medical profession actually feel about the Act?
Yeah, so there's probably three quite telling things that have happened in New Zealand society around this. The first one is the Doctors Say No letter, which was started a few years ago. It's an open letter to New Zealanders signed by doctors saying that they don't think this should be part of medicine, that this is medically unethical. Now, 1,700 doctors is about 10% of the doctor population in New Zealand. So the advocates of this act would say, wow, there's 90% of doctors that haven't signed up. But what's not really understood is this is historically quite incredible. Doctors do not step out of their comfort zone and sign open letters. They're quite a reticent bunch. They don't really like to put their heads above the pulpit. And the only other time this has happened in New Zealand's history is around the Rainbow Warrior time when 300 doctors signed an open letter. So we have got 5 times that number. This is basically the equivalent of a riot in medical terms.
Yes.
In terms. The other thing is the Justice Select Committee and the Health Select Committee submissions. I belong to a group called Care Alliance that audited, I did belong, I don't anymore, audited all the thousands and thousands of submissions. And we know for a fact that 600 doctors wrote in, said they were doctors, and 98% of them were opposed. So that's a pretty high number. And then there's the New Zealand Medical Association, who represents about 5,000 doctors, and they've written a very strong position statement against euthanasia just in the last few weeks. So we're getting a message. There is a Doctor Say Yes letter, you might be pleased to know, that has 27 signatures on it, and 10 of whom are retired doctors who won't be participating. So that's the information that we have from the medical fraternity.
There's also some polling that's been done and research that's been done into the opinions of doctors. And generally, over years, doctors have been asked if they're in favour of this kind of legislation or not. And generally, if you look at the medical practice as a whole, about 70% of doctors are opposed to this kind of legislation. But when you look at those doctors like Amanda, who deal with this on a really regular basis, that number becomes a lot higher. So you're getting up to 80 and 90% of doctors who are opposed to this kind of legislation because they deal with it on a daily basis, and they recognise that actually you're introducing further risk to a lot of these people, and that there are better ways to respond to people at the end of their life.
Well, one of the things that will often come up as a phrase is people, advocates against the legislation will describe it as unsafe, as risky law. And one of the questions that Yvette's asked just in our comment thread is just around the question of mental health. Mental health is a category that has obviously expanded as a health category over in recent times. And she's just really asking the question of, is there a risk of mental health being seen as an intolerable condition within, say, an assisted suicide or a euthanasia sort of context under the current legislation?
I think it's really important to start by saying, I said that Yvette's said that under the Act, she's talking about grievous and irremediable medical conditions, and that was originally included in the eligibility criteria. But throughout the parliamentary process over the last couple of years, there was space for some amendments to be made, and one of those amendments was to remove that particular piece of criteria because our politicians became very aware as to how broad that could be, and it could definitely move to include people who have mental illnesses. And in fact, another amendment that was made was to say that a person cannot be assisted to die for the sole reason of having a disability, having a mental illness, or being of advanced age. Now, that doesn't mean that those people can't be, but that cannot be the sole reason that they're assisted to die. So they must also fit the other criteria. The concern there is that, and Amanda will be able to speak to this probably better than I, but many terminal patients suffer depression in that initial phase of being diagnosed, and often that depression goes undetected. It's a very treatable depression, just like any other kind of depression, but it often goes undiagnosed. And so you will have, in fact, one piece of research that I read said that even some doctors who who are not specialising in end-of-life care would see it as an understandable depression and not see a need then to treat it. Instead, actually, these people who are depressed, who change their minds or are treated and experience life, a whole extension of these life experiences that they otherwise wouldn't have had if they had taken this choice, you are then included within the criteria.
The other thing is my husband worked with high needs adolescents, so very, highly disabled adolescents, and they would probably have a death a year in their community. It wasn't unusual. And so the line between disability and terminal illness is very blurry.
Yeah.
And the issue with this act is it's trying to put lines in the sand that don't exist. And trying to say that they're safe and that they're safeguards, but they aren't in real life. So I think the disability group is the group that's changed me the most. A little bit like Sam, I've spent some time with certain groups, and they're really fearful and they're really disturbed to hear the types of things that well people say are intolerable, that they deal with all the time. And the issue with is that doctors put value judgments on their lives. And so I remember having a patient, a young woman with lots and lots of epilepsy who was completely dependent, and her mother had people say to her, wouldn't she be better off dead? And that's the fear that they run, because she could possibly get 2 doctors to sign off on her daughter's assisted death if she was of a different mind or a different attitude. So, yeah, I think, there's a danger.
I have a story to add to that. A good friend of mine has some significant disabilities and often has to go into a pain clinic. And he talks about how he has days that are really dark, that are really, really hard. And what he needs and currently receives on those days is for the community around him, for the pain care, the nurse team around him to say, no, we really value you as a person. We believe that you have dignity, that your life has dignity, and we're going to help. We're going to do everything we can to help with the pain, but we're also going to remind you that we love you as a person and we want to help you, rather than being told, okay, well, here's an alternative option. Sometimes he might disagree with them and say, actually, I think I want that option right now. But in the days subsequent, when he's feeling better again, he's so thankful that that wasn't an option, that they weren't presenting that to him, because he might have taken it, and he doesn't. It's not the actual choice that he wants.
Amanda, right. I'm aware when this was being discussed in the UK, both the UK College of Physicians and I think General Practice came out, and one of the points they made was just how terrible doctors are actually at prognosticating out 6 months when it comes to terminal illness. Do you want to maybe say just a little bit about that?
Me?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, just Amanda.
Yeah.
Sorry, did I say Danielle?
Yeah.
Jump in.
So I tell this story where I worked. You could sign a contract to give people free end-of-life care if they had less than 30 days to live.
Right.
So we're talking about 90 days. Sorry, so this is 3 months. And in the cancer space, that's a little easier. In the chronic disease space, I wouldn't sign them off because it's too difficult. So that tells you something. And at one point I said to our needs assessor, can you just audit how well I've done over the last year? How many times have I got it right or wrong at 3 months? So I was getting it wrong 10% of the time. And this is what I do all the time. This is my expertise. So some people would go into care and they'd actually get good care and they'd thrive in residential care, much to people's kind of amazement. Nursing homes can actually be quite nice places. And so at 6 months, it would be diabolical. It would be.
I've heard it's exponential. So the further out you try to go, just the worse it gets.
Absolutely. Like, hand on heart, we would be getting it wrong, 1 in 4 times probably.
Yeah, what I hear is then it's in the final days and hours you can get relative.
Okay, that's a disturbing revelation for those of us who are not.
Sorry, Johnny. In the final days and hours of life, you can get relatively accurate, but in the weeks and months earlier, there's a lot of guesswork involved.
Just looking at a question coming in from Melissa, which I think is a good one. Just around, what are, I know Sam, you spoke to them, some of these in your talk at the beginning, but just what are some of the positives for the bill as it currently stands that we're voting on, and are there ways that you think it can be particularly misleading in terms of some of the information that's out there? One question that I'm really interested in as part of that is just the overseas experience. It seems to me that that's a legacy which is, seems to be owned by everyone. It's hard to get a true picture of what's happening in places like the Netherlands and Belgium, which have had this law before, so laws like this. So, yeah, what are some positive arguments for the bill?
And more recently,
what's your view on some of those sort of misleading things that have been...
Amanda, you had some interesting things that are coming out of Victoria already, and they've only had theirs for 12 months. So the ones that are sort of, we can look down 20 years down the track, but also 12 months.
Yeah, so just a couple of things there. The most common yes arguments are choice. My body, my choice gets used a lot. You wouldn't put a pet through this. Actually, I palliated my cat and he took his last breath on my lounge floor. Pain and suffering, so very much what Sam talked about. The sense that death must be painful and terrible for everybody. And dignity. So they're the main ones. And I don't know if any of you have heard about the book, The Final Choice, which was written by Carolise Trays just recently, a New Zealand journalist who went looking for information and investigated this area. And she's landed in the no camp. And when someone questioned her, I was at one of her presentations, about why she was so unbalanced, she said, I didn't go out to be unbalanced. I went out to interview both sides of the argument. But when I got to the advocates for the Act, I heard about choice and autonomy and pain and suffering over and over. There wasn't anything new coming through. But when I went to the people who didn't want this Act to come in, I got a doctor's perspective and a lawyer's and disability. And there were so many different angles. I ended up interviewing so many different people. And I really got that. So that they are the main arguments. When it comes to overseas, it's really interesting. My mentor and boss went to Canada for her sabbatical a couple of years ago, and they'd had their legislation for 2 years. So she witnessed one of their assessments for assisted dying, and she talked to a cancer doctor afterwards who had put himself on the list of assisted dying doctors to make sure that it happened properly. That was his reasoning. And he said he was so disturbed by the number of people that came for assisted dying that didn't know their choices. So there you go. They didn't have the right conversations. They didn't know what their choices were. And then just last year, I was having dinner in Sydney with some of the Melbourne colleagues of mine that I've known for years. And all they could talk about at dinner was the new assisted dying law and what change it had made. And what it's done is pushed out specialist appointments for people who want to live, so they have to wait longer. And it's created a third discharge destination for the frail elderly on the wards. So you get discharged home, or you get discharged to residential care, or you may as well pop off. So just in 1 year, this kind of sense of duty to die has already permeated into the Victorian health system.
Yeah, and I think in Canada you see some similar responses. The legislation there has been there for about 4 years now, and already you see a significant number of people being requesting and being assisted to die. So I think about 2% of their death rate are now people who are being assisted to die. In comparison, in the Netherlands, where the legislation has been in place for almost 20 years, the death rate, or the number of people, the proportion of the death rate of people who are being assisted to die is 4%. So they're catching up pretty quickly. And I think what's really interesting is you compare that to Oregon, which is considered the golden kind of example. They've got the tightest restrictions. They've got only assisted suicide and not euthanasia. So assisted suicide being a self-administered medication, so something that you would take yourself, probably a pill or a liquid, whereas euthanasia is something that would be administered to you, so like an injection. In Canada, you have both of those available. In Oregon, you only have assisted suicide available, and the death rate is much lower, so it's about 0.5% of their death rate. In New Zealand, what we've got here is both are included in the legislation, and so we can expect similarly high numbers of people being assisted to die.
And we have 30,000 deaths a year, Johnny, in New Zealand, so we're talking about 1,200 people. It's not going to be a last resort. It's not going to be rare. It's actually going to be happening on a weekly basis all around the country.
And when we go back to earlier, before everyone else joined us, we were talking about the normality of dying. And I had the privilege of spending some time with a doctor from the UK, Dr. Catherine Mannix, who wrote a beautiful book called With the End in Mind last year. And her mission is to normalize death and to talk about it more, because she says, 100 years ago, someone who was my age would have seen death multiple times with the people that they lived in community with, the person down the street, with family members. And so they understood the process of dying. In our society today, you can get to 30 or 40 and never have seen a death. And when you do, it's behind closed doors, it's extreme and often unrealistic when it's on TV or in the news. And we don't understand what this process looks like. So it's really that can become so detrimental when we're talking about this issue, because we're not really sure what we're scared of. There's a fear of the unknown there.
Just seeing Oscar's question, and it's maybe the most fundamental question of all is, and it goes back to the sort of philosophical question around what does this bill actually say about who we are as a society and our attitude to human life? How do we actually view human life now fundamentally? I think maybe the most fundamental question we can ask at a time like this.
Yeah, I'll tell a wee story to highlight that one. I met a wife at a carer's education session. I hadn't met her husband, he was the one dying, but I knew that he had been a principal of a school in his younger days. And I walked through the hospice and I saw her there, and she said to me, he's in his last few days in the hospice. And I said, all right. She said, oh, it's so pointless, isn't it? Why don't we just, just want to get it over with. There's no real reason. We're all just sitting around doing nothing. I said, all right, yeah. And she said, that's really interesting. All these people are coming in to visit him. They've heard about each other for years but never met each other, and all of a sudden they're connecting and seeing each other. It's like, wow, he's kind of bringing people together, isn't he? And she was like, oh, yeah, I guess. And she said, and they keep saying they'd never seen a dying person before, remarking what it's like to actually see someone dying. And I said, wow, he's kind of teaching people, isn't he? And she went, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. He was a teacher. And I said, yeah, I had heard that he was a teacher. He's still teaching people. And she said, oh, and a friend came in and drew a cartoon of him when he was a younger man. Come in the room and see the picture. And we went in, and he's lying very peacefully in his bed with his son reading a book beside him, just being present with his dad. And she showed me this picture, and I said, look, he's inspiring people. So from the fact that he was lying in bed in the last hours of his life, he was connecting, he was inspiring, and he was teaching people. And that's what we need to value and tell people is important. That's the essence of humanity and value until our last breath.
I've been spending a lot of time over another area of work that I've been looking at for the past few years is disability and employment. So related but separate. And it's become really clear to me that as a society, we care about people. The phrase that I use is who fit on a magazine cover, or who can contribute financially to society. There's a bit of a utilitarian bent there, right? We're interested in contributions, but outside of that, it doesn't really, we don't care so much. And I find that quite heartbreaking, because there are people who contribute in ways that we don't see or understand just by being around, and who contribute immense value to society. People like my friend who has severe pain and disability, and the amount that he can offer intellectually, and he's so incredibly caring and kind, and as a friend, that has immense value, and we need to recognize that even at the end of life, there is value.
I think there's one thing to remember, and this act is individualism at its finest. It's all about me, me, me. And it's a Eurocentric kind of view. It's a view of, self-care. And when you take it wider and you look at the Māori population and the Pacific peoples, it doesn't resonate with them at all. This is a kind of for a very select few who want control, but going to affect others with dire consequences. It's such a dichotomy. It's just, so dangerous.
Yeah, Johnny, I was going to just basically almost reframe the question slightly. Society's attitude towards human life, but the way that human life plays out, I think, like the need to control, the need to make sure that nothing gets outside of my control, or is messy, or is uncomfortable, or is this idea that one can have a clean death, and it's going to be sterile. It's going to have all the nasty bits taken out of it, and it's going to look like this. It's not possible. And so, doctors work in that space of making it as comfortable as possible, and yet you can't make it not a death. And so we need conversations around this. To go to the question, someone asking what are some of the arguments for it, I heard someone say just last week on a panel, "Oh, this is great. If we put this through, this will be great. This will get people talking about death. Blunt instrument to fix a problem. We can talk better about death than we should be without going to a change in legislation to do so." I'm not sure if you a few glitches come through on my screen, but
just as part of that question, too, I guess part of the acknowledgement is that as a society in New Zealand, we are not, a single homogenous society. We're made up of different communities with different views on the role of the individual and the role of, illness and death within that. And one of the issues that seems to be coming up a lot is just the lack of consultation across different sorts of communities, including Māori and Pacifica, who do have quite a different perspective on these things. Is there any sort of reflections you want to add to that, just around, that aspect of the political process, I guess, and what that reflects on us as a community?
It's been really interesting over the last few weeks to see a bit of a dialogue starting to emerge around equality and the healthcare system. And I'm hearing comments around Māori and Pacifica peoples find it difficult to negotiate or not well represented within the healthcare system. And when we introduce a piece of legislation like this, that becomes even more concerning, because the consequences are not something that we can reverse. They are, they're finite or final. And so for myself, as someone who is an educated young woman, I'm Pākehā, I live in the centre of a big city. Healthcare is really available to me, but in places like Tokoroa or on the East Coast, that could be really difficult for someone else who has to travel a couple of hours to get to the closest hospital, who doesn't know how to negotiate the healthcare system. My dad's medical, and even then it can be complicated trying to figure out who you have to talk to and what process to go through. It isn't straightforward. So I do think that while we have incredible palliative care in New Zealand, there is work to be done to improve the equality and of access to that, particularly for Māori and Pacifica New Zealanders. And that is a conversation that, and there are some actions that we need to be taken there long before we're even having this conversation.
Yeah, I think the concern for me is, particularly with Pacific communities, they're really hard to engage anyway. And then we introduce a legislation where doctors kill people. Mm. And I worked in the Northern Territory for a year with my family about 8 years after their legislation was repealed by the federal government. So I can't remember, they had about 9 euthanasia deaths, I think, before it was repealed. And as I sat as a Kiwi in this team, 40% of our patient population was Aboriginal. Learning, the cultural safety and all the competence that I needed to quite quickly, it became very apparent that it had caused distrust, significant distrust between the Aboriginal community and that white mob, as they're called. So not only did they have difficulty before interacting and engaging and getting their trust and around their suspicions and all sorts of things, it had made it worse. Mm. And I think this conversation, this debate, and the misinformation that's going round and round has actually made the job of the palliative care services in New Zealand harder. We already had trouble getting into some homes because of this perception or old school view of what we did. Mm-hmm. And politicians and people saying they just want to control you. They want to take away your choices. It's actually harming the palliative care community and the work that it's trying to do. And nobody seems to be talking about that. But I was starting to see it in the last, 2 or 3 years, getting doors slammed in our faces and really trying to figure out why, because we just want to help. We just want to work with you. We're going to meet you where you are. We don't care if you've got drug and alcohol issues. We're not trying to change your lifestyle. We just want to meet with you and find out how we can help. So I think it's been quite a harmful thing already.
And you see that already overseas in places like the Netherlands and Oregon and Belgium. People who are in favour of this kind of legislation are very quick to point out that palliative care is available in these places. But actually, you talk to palliative care doctors or hospice doctors from that part of the world, and they'll say, well, the kind of palliative care that you get in New Zealand is very different and far superior to what they're receiving there. In New Zealand, we're ranked 3rd in the world for the palliative care that we have. And my understanding is that there is need to, as I was saying earlier, improve the access to that. There are conversations that should be had around funding and training in medical schools. But to think that the palliative care that we receive won't be hurt by introducing a law like this, I think is a bit blind.
Yeah, Amanda, you raised a really interesting point before we went live, which is maybe not a way of thinking about it. It's more a sort of hard-headed, medical practitioner perspective. But, we're sort of living in a world where medical resources are under pressure this year with the COVID pandemic, and we're seeing policy, national policy, economic policy even built around protecting health resources. And you raised an interesting point before we went live here, just around that question of allocation of health resources, how it affects this particular issue. It's maybe not something that we think about as we vote on something like this. We vote in isolation. But I think you were making a point before about just actually the holistic picture of, a pretty limited range of medical resources and how we allocate those.
Yeah, so we have DHBs in deficit all over the country. In Canterbury, we're making the news for our deficit, and services are going to have to be cut. And then we're about to vote on a referendum, which is going to need an entire resource built around it. It's going to need money and funding. It's a new government department with big salaries. And every DHB is going to have to put aside what it's doing and start working on policies and procedures for assisted dying in its wards, in its outpatients potentially, or in homes. GPs are going to have to kind of sort this out. It'll be fee for service if GPs are doing it. They won't do it for free. So when you start drilling down into the practicalities, which you can tell people didn't think about when they wrote this legislation, it's going to take money away from perhaps medications that we know have evidence behind them that work and help people to live better lives. The inflammatory bowel group have just had 20-year-olds who have a new medication that's available in Australia and other parts of the world, but Pharmac won't fund it here. And so we're saying no on one end to things that actually give quality of life and longevity of life, to actually put funding into something that's for kind of an elite few who want to contain control. So it just seems so bizarre to me. I don't think people have really thought about the cost aspect and the resource aspect that it's going to take to make this role. The other thing I can see coming up is around the medication and the details in the Act. We have no idea. And the kinds of medications that might be used won't be medications that doctors normally use. This is not what we're trained to do. If it's oral, it's going to be tens of tablets swallowed down, trying to get, it's not going to be one pill. We've got to get away from this narrative of this kind of, one pill lying there, it's all going to be lovely. I mean, you don't necessarily die straight away. So I just think the narrative's been written in one way and the reality is going to be completely different. And it will be too late by the time people realise.
One of the other things I remember chatting to you about last week, Amanda, was the sort of the irony of the time we find ourselves in at the moment, this COVID time, where there's been an almost exhaustive medical consultation that lives might be saved, while this has been grumbling along in the background with almost no medical consultation. The irony of these two things going on at the same time, the nation brought to a standstill so that we can save lives, while we then vote for some of those, on legislation like this, with almost no medical consultation in the Act, which you've alluded to.
Yeah, I found this year fascinating because within 48 hours, all New Zealanders gave up their rights. Freedom, rights to work, rights to travel, without a blink of an eye. They gave up these rights, my body, my choice rights, to help vulnerable people, to save lives, to do the right thing for their community. And they did it on the back of a Prime Minister and a public health physician. And the public health physician, who's the Attorney General, Ashley Bloomfield, he used science, he used his knowledge, he had a team of people saying, this is what we need to do. And then fast forward to the End of Life Choice Act, and we have a medical fraternity saying, this is not possible, this law is not workable, it's not something that we want to do as doctors. We need the community to give up their rights and choices again, team of 5 million, and actually say, no, we want to protect our vulnerable. Now, vulnerable doesn't mean old. You can be vulnerable like Sam was when he had his surgery. So we actually have to give up our right to want someone to put us down for the good of other people. It is exactly the same, but unfortunately it's not seen like that.
Yeah, it builds on this idea of choice that you were talking about earlier, Sam. Choice is, when we talk about the law, it's really easy to think that we can create these boundaries or these groups of choice and exceptions within the law, but the law doesn't work that way. It's a really blunt tool, and it is written to protect vulnerable people. And so when it can't include or can't be written for those exceptions to the law, we have to recognise that we're writing legislation that is both for the person who is autonomous, who is resolute in their decision, the person who knows that if they change their mind and don't want to be assisted by that, they'll have the support and love of their family through that. But it's also for the person who is vulnerable. It's also for the person who has financial pressures, who doesn't want to be a burden on their family, whether that's implicit or explicit, the person who has difficulty communicating, so maybe English isn't their first language. We have to remember that when we're voting in the referendum, we're not just voting for ourselves, we're voting for other people in society.
So there's a question come through about how it got this far with no medical consultation. Well, that's a story in itself. It was pulled out of the ballot box quite close to the end of the year. It might have been 2018. And those of us who were hoping it wasn't going to be pulled out, started getting together to decide what to do. And then it got pushed through in the first reading before Parliament was closed for the year. So there's been a lot of political, I want to use the word shenanigans, or political power plays in the back rooms. And then the Greens, sorry if anyone's a Green supporter, but the Greens came out with a position statement for the Act. And so all of their MPs had to vote yes. And New Zealand First, of course, came out at the third reading and said that their MPs had to vote yes as well, so it would go through to a referendum. And there was some toing and froing. Nobody seemed too concerned with the wording of the Act. And the advocates of the Act would say it's had extensive consultation with the Justice Select Committee and the Health Select Committee, which is true, but 92% of the submissions were opposed, which doesn't appear to have been kind of entered into any consciousness of the MPs. And then I guess some of the people who didn't want the Act to go through started trying to put amendments in, and almost all the amendments were voted down. So it's a kind of a perfect storm, and people just couldn't really get any sense out of the MPs, some of them. Remember, list MPs don't have constituents. I went to visit quite a few MPs, and one said to me she changed her vote because she had a big disability sector in her constituency and they had told her to vote no. So, and list MPs don't have that. They want to vote kind of along the lines of their leaders because that's how they go up the rankings. So it was a perfect storm, and it happened, and it hasn't had consultation.
I just want to add to that. The Act has been through this political process. It's been through the Select Committee process and the Committee of the Whole House, and those were the opportunities for New Zealanders to offer their opinion and then to for amendments to be made by the politicians through what are called supplementary order papers. And then now that the bill has passed, it's been through a royal assent, there are no more opportunities for the bill to be amended. And I get that question a bit, can we change it? Can we improve it? You've got these concerns, can't we just make it better? Well, actually, no, we can't unless we go back through the system. So really this vote that we have, this is our opportunity to decide what happens. A friend said to me a little while ago, it's kind of like New Zealand has become Parliament, and she's right. We have this responsibility now, because it's a referendum, to be members of Parliament, to give a conscience vote, and to what that means then is to consider the legislation, to do things like listen into events like this. I'm always so encouraged when these kinds of events are happening, because it means that people are doing their homework. But to do this, to learn, to listen to the arguments, and then to talk to people about it, and then go into that voting booth. And as I said before, remember that you're not just voting for yourself, but to vote and vote for the community. This is a binding referendum, so it's different from the cannabis referendum, which is not non-binding. There are opportunities for the legislation there to change, but what we're talking about here is a binding referendum. This is the final text of the Act.
Yes, this will go into force and will become a part of our culture from October 17th.
A year after the.
Sorry, yes, yeah. But it's kind of like the it's not. There's not another bite at this. There's not another fork in the road or an opportunity for it. This is there's an inevitability about what happens on October 17th. Johnny, I don't know whether we're getting close to time, but just one last thing I wanted to say before maybe we do is to encourage folk who are listening to have conversations about this with people. One of the questions earlier was kind of like, how are people being misled by the information out there? Yes, possibly, but there's a lot of people that just haven't really given this a lot of thought, and they haven't slowed down long enough to sort of think, oh yeah, what about dysfunctional families? These are waters that they're going to have to navigate too. I remember changing the mind, Amanda, when we were over in Perth doing something with the palliative care guys over there. One of my Uber rides, I changed the mind of the Uber driver in sort of 6 minutes across Perth, just because he just had his mum die, and he was kind of like, oh, why would you not have euthanasia? But turns out she had died really well. They were a really a loving family, and just by mentioning the difficulty of complex families, I changed his mind. And so just to encourage people to be having conversations. You'll be surprised how many of your friends and family probably haven't thought as deeply about this as you have. If you've even tuned into this, you've probably spent more time dedicated to thinking this through than a lot of people have been able to. The perfect storm has continued, Amanda, because we're doing this under COVID conditions. People's news feeds are full of other stuff. Their minds are full of other stuff. They're just trying to get by and do life. And so you can quite quickly introduce conversations, not to be controversial, but just to get people thinking.
I'm going to ask you, Sam, you're right, we are coming into land. It's been an amazing conversation. I'm sure people would love us to go on. But I want to, two questions really to each of you, and you may choose to let the first one go and just answer the second one. But first of all, how does your faith make a difference here? How does that impact on the way you think about this? It may just be an aspect of the discussion. And secondly, if there's one thing you'd say to someone on the polls about this legislation, what would it be?
I think I would say it's really important to not tick the box for yourself. It needs to be beyond yourself and your one story. This is for the entire of society. This is for your fellow neighbours and your friends and your community. So please, please, please think wider than yourself.
I think it's something that I've been saying a lot, is that this isn't a piece of legislation that you need to be a Christian to be opposed to. Actually, what we've been talking about for a lot of this evening is just around the law and how it works in practice, and the medical practice and how that works. And there yes, as Christians, there are theological worldview and ideas that help us understand, but the real arguments about this piece of legislation are not necessarily Christian or non-Christian. So that would be my response to your first question. To the second, I would completely echo what Amanda just said, and maybe build on that by saying, look, when you look at this legislation, when you read the words on the page, it might sound really clear cut, but you put that into the practice, the messiness, the realities of everyday life, and it becomes so much more complex. And people who you and the small group of people that you might have had in mind as being eligible for this and being assisted to die, they might be, but in reality that group will be much wider, and people that you didn't intend it for will be assisted to die.
It's too risky.
Yeah, Johnny, I mean, I spoke a bit about how my faith informs it. I guess it reframes things like dignity for me, and in ways that I can still share those understandings with people who don't have a faith, but for me, my faith helps to inform that, and the care we should be taking, the compassion we should be taking for those who are most vulnerable. I guess in terms of someone who was about to walk into the polling booth, I'd probably hand them some info from places overseas. I'd say, does Belgium, does the Netherlands, does Oregon sound like the sort of place you want New Zealand to look and feel like in 20 years' time? Because it will be. And I quote from someone like Theo Bloore for a reason. He's an academic. I mean, all four of us on screen at the moment have been lectured by dozens of academics probably between us. Have you ever heard an academic back down and say they got something terribly wrong? I don't know. I almost never have. It's almost unheard of for an academic to do that. But here's a guy who's put his professional reputation completely on the line and said, we got that 100% wrong. And if I had my time again, I would not do that. I mean, my question is, what New Zealander is going to be doing that in 20 years' time? Are we going to have David Seymour hand-wringing when some other country is going for it and going, I got this completely wrong. I should have listened. That would be my advice, is have a look around, Google those names, Theo Bloore, Gerbert van Lernen, and others. Read about it. Is that the sort of country you want to be in 20 years' time? We don't have to imagine a counterfactual. We've got them sitting there for us to look at.
Well, Amanda, Danielle, and Sam, thanks so much for being part of what I think has actually been an amazing conversation, incredible amount covered, in such a broad issues from the principle down to the actual details of the legislation. So I want to thank you all for being in on this. Appreciate your passion and all that you're bringing, from your own vocations to, what is such an important issue. And I think an important issue raised too, that, this is the first part of at least these first two parts of our big issue series, when we're looking at what is the political process, how do we get involved, whether we're people of faith or not, and that there is this new responsibility, I think, in this governance by referenda to actually step in to the political process in a new way, in a different way, in a more proactive way, and to bring some influence to bear, particularly as people of faith. So I want to thank you guys for being involved tonight. I want to invite you to next week. We've got Simon O'Connor, among others, just to talk about cannabis referendum coming up, the non-binding referendum, as well as what does it mean to be involved in the political process. So thanks everyone for being involved. Thanks for joining us tonight. Hope you've been informed and enriched by this conversation, and we hope to see you next week. You can actually find Matt Bruns on Facebook for evening prayer as well, if you're up for that. So God bless you heaps. We'll see you soon.